The hall stretched endlessly before her, its walls carved from living crystal that pulsed with cold blue light. And Commander Sarah Vance walked through it with her head held high, even though her hands were bound behind her back. 12 thrones rose in a circle around the central platform, each one holding a being from a different species, each one older than human civilization itself, and each one looking down at her with something between pity and disgust. She still wore her uniform, though they had torn away every medal and every insignia, leaving only torn fabric where her rank had once been displayed proudly on her chest. The blood of her crew members still remained under her fingernails because she had dragged 7 of them to the escape pods with her own hands before the explosion consumed everything. "Commander Sarah Vance of the Human Defense Fleet," the Archon announced, its crystalline body refracting the light into 1,000 painful shards. "You stand before the Tribunal of the Concord to answer for your crimes against galactic peace." Sarah said nothing because she had learned long ago that these beings did not actually want to hear what humans had to say. The Archon continued, its voice resonating through the chamber like wind through broken glass. 3 days ago, you violated 17 interstellar treaties when you deliberately crashed your vessel into the Gathari dreadnought above the colony world of New Harmony. I saved 40,000 colonists, Sarah finally spoke, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that pulled at every muscle in her body. You destroyed 2 fleets, a different voice cut in, belonging to a massive creature that looked like a mountain of moss and stone. You killed 12,000 Cathari warriors and 800 of your own crew members. The Cathari were going to glass the entire planet, Sarah replied. They had already begun their bombardment when we arrived, and they refused every attempt at communication. That is not for you to decide, the Archon declared. The Cathari had filed a territorial claim on that world through proper channels, and your species had no legal right to establish a colony there in the first place. Sarah felt her jaw tighten because this was the part she had expected and the part she hated most of all. Humanity had joined the galactic community only 80 years ago, and in that time, they had been treated like children playing with dangerous toys, given permission to settle only on worlds that no other species wanted, restricted from developing certain technologies, and constantly reminded that they were the youngest and therefore the least important voices in any room. So the proper response, Sarah said slowly, would have been to let them murder 40,000 innocent people while we filed a complaint through your bureaucracy. The proper response would have been to contact the Concord peacekeeping forces and allow them to handle the situation. A being that looked like a giant spider made of silver wire clicked from its throne. Your peacekeeping forces were 6 days away. Sarah shot back. 6 days. And the Cathari were already burning cities when we dropped out of hyperspace. Then those colonists would have died as a consequence of humanity's illegal expansion, the Archon said. And there was no emotion in its voice at all. That would have been a tragedy. But it would not have disrupted the balance of power that has maintained peace in this galaxy for 15,000 years. Sarah stared at the crystalline being and felt something cold settle into her chest. Something harder than anger and deeper than despair. She understood now, perhaps for the first time, exactly what humanity meant to these ancient species. They were not partners or allies or even potential equals. They were a nuisance to be managed, a fire to be contained, a dangerous animal that needed to be kept in its cage until it learned to behave. You are not punishing me for breaking treaties, Sarah said quietly. You are punishing my entire species for refusing to watch our people die. We are protecting the galaxy from a species that has not yet learned restraint, the Archon replied. Humanity has been part of the galactic community for less than a century. And in that time you have started 4 wars, colonized worlds without permission, and now committed an act of aggression that killed thousands of Cathari citizens. They were soldiers attacking a civilian population. Sira interrupted. They were citizens of a Concord member species. The Archon's voice rose for the first time. And you killed them without authorization, without trial, and without any consideration for the consequences your actions might have for the rest of the galaxy. The chamber fell silent, and Sira could feel the weight of 12 ancient gazes pressing down on her like a physical force. The tribunal has reached its decision, the Archon announced. Commander Sarah Vance, you are hereby stripped of all rank and all honors, and you are permanently banned from holding any military or governmental position within human space. Sira had expected that, and she kept her face still. Furthermore, the Archon continued, and now there was something almost like satisfaction in its resonating voice. The Concord has determined that humanity as a species is not yet ready for full participation in galactic society. A murmur ran through the chamber, and Sira felt her heart begin to pound, effective immediately. All quantum gates connecting human space to the rest of the galaxy will be sealed, and humanity will be confined to your home system until such time as the Concord determines. You have developed sufficient maturity to rejoin the galactic community. The words hit her like physical blows, each one driving the breath from her lungs. The quantum gates were everything because without them, humanity could not travel faster than light, could not trade with other species, could not expand or explore or do anything except sit in their tiny corner of space and wait. You cannot do this, Sira heard herself say. You cannot punish billions of people for my actions. We are not punishing them, the Archon replied. We are protecting them and protecting the galaxy from them, until they learn that the universe does not bend to human will. 2 guards made of pure energy materialized beside her and began to drag her toward the exit. Sira twisted in their grip. Looking back at the tribunal, at the 12 beings who had just decided the fate of her entire species without even pretending to feel conflicted about it, you think you are containing us, she shouted, her voice echoing off the crystal walls. You think you can seal us away, and we will simply accept it. The Archon tilted its head, regarding her with what might have been curiosity. What else can you do, Commander Vance? Because you have no ships capable of faster than light travel without our gates. And you have no allies who would risk their own standing to help you. Sira stopped struggling and stood very still, meeting the Archon's faceted eyes with her own. Watch me, she said. Then the guards pulled her through the doors, and they sealed behind her with a sound like a tomb closing. 3 weeks later, the last human ship passed through the quantum gate connecting Sol to the rest of the galaxy. And then the gate collapsed into darkness. Earth received no explanation, no apology, and no timeline for when the isolation might end. Only silence and Commander Sarah Vance, disgraced and forgotten by everyone except herself, disappeared into the research stations orbiting Jupiter, carrying nothing but her anger and a single burning thought. They had taken humanity's door to the stars. She would build another one. 37 years is a long time to carry anger. But Sarah Vance had never been good at letting things go. The research station orbiting Europa was cold and dark and forgotten by almost everyone, which made it the perfect place to do impossible work. And Sira had gathered around her a small collection of people who still believed that humanity deserved more than a cage. Her hair had gone gray, and her face had collected scars from a dozen industrial accidents. But her eyes still burned with the same fire that had driven her to ram her ship into a Cathari dreadnought all those decades ago. The simulation failed again, Dr. Yuki Tanaka announced, pulling off her safety goggles and rubbing her tired eyes. The energy requirements are still 3 times higher than anything our reactors can produce. Sira looked at the holographic display floating in the center of the laboratory, watching the mathematical model of their experimental engine collapse into chaos for the 100th time. Then we need better reactors, she replied simply. We have been saying that for 15 years. Marcus Webb growled from his position beneath a massive tangle of machinery, his hands covered in grease and his patience worn thin. At some point we need to accept that this might actually be impossible. The Concord species did it, Sierra said. They built the quantum gate somehow, which means faster than light travel is not impossible. The Concord species have been spacefaring for millions of years, Yuki pointed out gently. They have technologies we cannot even comprehend, and they guard the secrets of the gates more closely than anything else in the galaxy. Sierra turned away from the display and walked to the observation window, looking out at the swirling storms of Jupiter and the distant pinprick of light. That was the sun. Somewhere beyond that light was Earth, where billions of people had grown up knowing nothing but the boundaries of their own solar system. A whole generation had been born since the sealing. Children who had never seen an alien sky and who had been taught in their schools that humanity had been justly punished for its arrogance. Many of them believed it. Many of them had stopped dreaming of the stars entirely. What do we know about the quantum gates? Sarah asked, turning back to face her team. Not how they work, because the Concord will never tell us that. But why they work? Yuki frowned and called up a different set of data on the holographic display. They use quantum entanglement to create a stable connection between 2 points in space, essentially folding the distance between them so that ships can travel from one gate to another instantaneously. And the gates themselves are controlled by the Concord, Sarah continued. They decide who can use them, when they can use them, and where they can go. That is how they maintain their power, Marcus said, emerging from beneath the machinery to wipe his hands on a rag. If you control all the roads, you control all the trade and all the communication and all the travel. And anyone who disobeys you can simply be cut off like they did to us. So the gates are not just technology, Sarah said slowly, her mind working through an idea that had been forming for years. They are a leash, and the Concord holds the other end. What are you thinking? Yuki asked. Sarah smiled, and it was not a kind smile. I am thinking that we have been approaching this problem wrong, because we have been trying to figure out how to use their gates again. But maybe what we need is something else entirely. She walked to a secondary console and began pulling up old files, documents and theories that had been dismissed decades ago as too dangerous or too impractical before the quantum gates. The earliest Concord species experimented with other forms of faster than light travel. She explained. They called it breach technology, and it worked by literally tearing a hole in the fabric of space and pushing through to another location. I know this research, Yuki said, leaning forward with sudden interest. They abandoned it because it was too unstable and too destructive, and the energy released by each breach caused massive damage to the surrounding space. They also abandoned it because it required something they did not have, Sarah continued, something that made it too costly for them to use. What was that? Marcus asked. Sarah turned to face them both, her eyes bright with something that was either brilliance or madness. A pilot willing to die. The silence in the laboratory stretched for a long moment. The breach technology required a living mind to navigate the chaos between spaces, Sarah explained. The mathematical calculations were too complex and too fast for any computer to handle. And the sensory input from inside, a breach would destroy any normal neural system within seconds. So they needed a biological pilot, Yuki said slowly. But the process was fatal. For them, yes, Sarah agreed. But humans are different. She called up another set of files. These ones containing decades of research into human neurology and the strange resilience of the human brain. Our neural architecture is not like theirs, she said. We evolved on a world where our brains had to constantly process massive amounts of conflicting sensory information. And we developed something they never did. The ability to function through pain and confusion and impossible conditions. You think humans can survive the breach? Marcus said, and there was wonder in his voice. I think humans might be the only species in the galaxy who can, Sarah replied. And I think that is exactly why the Concords sealed us away. Because they looked at our history and our biology, and they realized that if we ever figured out this technology, they would have no way to stop us. This is insane, Yuki whispered. But she was already moving toward the console, already pulling up new calculations. Even if humans can theoretically survive the neural load, the physical strain would be extraordinary, and the margin for error would be almost nothing. Then we make it work, Sarah said simply. We have 37 years of anger and a laboratory full of the smartest people humanity has ever produced. And we have something else the Concord species never had. What is that? Marcus asked. Sarah looked at them both. At these brilliant, stubborn people who had given up everything to chase an impossible dream in a forgotten corner of space. We have nothing left to lose, she said. And people with nothing to lose are capable of anything. The door to the laboratory opened, and a young man stepped inside. His eyes wide as he looked around at the equipment and the holographic displays, he was barely 20 years old. With black hair and a pilot's reflexes and a look on his face like someone who had just found exactly what he was looking for. Is this the Ember Project? He asked. I heard you are looking for pilots who are not afraid to burn. Sarah studied him for a long moment, seeing the hunger in his eyes and the steadiness in his hands. What is your name? She asked. Jonah Chen, he replied. I was born after the ceiling, and I have never seen an alien sky. But I have dreamed about them every night of my life. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Something that might have been hope. Welcome to the team, she said. We have a lot of work to do, and in the cold laboratories of Europa, surrounded by stolen research and impossible equations, the spark that would burn down the Concord's empire began to catch fire. The ship they built was ugly by any standard. A brutal collection of angles and exposed engines, held together by welded metal and human stubbornness. They called it the Defiance, and it sat in the hidden hangar bay beneath. Europa's ice like a weapon waiting to be fired. Sarah Vance ran her hand along the hull, feeling the vibration of the Prometheus engine humming deep within its core. And she allowed herself a moment of quiet wonder at what they had created. 40 years of work had led to this moment. 40 years of failure and success and failure again. Of watching colleagues die in test runs and burn out from exhaustion. Of stealing resources and hiding from the government officials who would have shut them down if they had ever learned what was happening in this frozen corner of space. And now the engine was complete. And there was only one thing left to do. The neural interface is ready, Yuki announced from the control room, her voice crackling over the intercom. All systems are showing green, and the breach coordinates have been locked in. What are our chances? Marcus asked, standing beside Sar with his arms crossed over his chest. About 40% that the ship survives the breach, Yuki replied honestly. About 20% that the pilot survives with them. Those are terrible odds. Marcus said, those are the best odds we have ever had, Sarah replied. And she began walking toward the boarding ramp. Jonah Chun was waiting at the entrance, dressed in the specially designed flight suit that would monitor his vital signs and pump him full of drugs to keep his heart beating through the impossible strain of what was coming. Commander, he said, stepping aside to let her pass. The ship is ready when you are. Sarah stopped and looked at him. At this young man who had spent the last 17 years training for a mission that would probably kill him. I never asked you why you volunteered, she said. Jonah was quiet for a moment, staring at the ship that would either carry them to the stars or become their tomb. My mother used to tell me stories about the galaxy, he said finally. She was a child when the gates were sealed, and she remembered what it was like to look up at the sky and know that there were Wonders out there beyond counting. He turned to face Sarah, and there was no fear in his eyes. She died never seeing those wonders again, he continued. She died believing that her children and her grandchildren would never see them either. In the end, I think that was what killed her more than the cancer ever did. And you want to prove her wrong, Sarah said. I want to prove them all wrong, Jonah replied. I want every child born after the ceiling to look up at the sky and know that nothing can keep humanity from the stars. Not gates and not laws and not the entire Concord standing in our way. Sarah felt her throat tighten, and she reached out to grip his shoulder. Then let us go prove them wrong together, she said. They boarded the Defiance and took their positions. Jonah in the secondary pilot seat monitoring systems and running calculations, and Sarah in the primary seat with her hands on the controls and the neural interface pressing cold against the back of her skull. She was 73 years old, and her body had been failing for years, but her mind was still sharp, and her will was still iron. If anyone was going to fly through impossible fire, it was going to be her Prometheus engine spinning up, Yuki announced over the comms. Breach coordinates confirmed. Destination is the Outer Rim Trading Hub in Sector 7, approximately 400 light-years from our current position. The Concorde will detect this the moment we emerge. Marcus added, You will have maybe 30 seconds before their response fleet arrives. 30 seconds is all I need, Sarah replied. And she began the ignition sequence. The engine roared to life behind her, and she felt the ship begin to shake as power levels climbed beyond anything that should have been possible. Warning lights flashed across every console, and alarms began screaming that the hull was experiencing stresses it was never designed to handle. And then the breach opened a space in front of the Defiance simply tore apart. A wound in reality that burned with colors that had no names and shapes that made no sense to human eyes. Sarah felt the neural interface slam into her consciousness like a hammer. And suddenly she was not just seeing the breach, she was inside it. Her mind stretched across impossible geometries and howling chaos. Pain exploded through every nerve in her body. And she heard herself screaming, but could not stop because the alternative was letting go. And if she let go, the breach would tear the ship apart and scatter them across 1,000 light-years. She pushed forward. The chaos fought her, trying to rip the ship in every direction at once. But Sarah held the course through sheer force of will, navigating by instinct and desperation through a place where the laws of physics had no meaning. She saw things in the breach that she would never be able to describe. Glimpses of other dimensions and other possibilities. Fragments of realities where humanity had never existed, or had conquered the galaxy, or had destroyed itself in nuclear fire. And through it all, she kept pushing, kept driving the Defiance toward the light at the other end of the madness. The breach lasted exactly 4.7 seconds. It felt like 4.7 years, and then they were through, bursting into normal space with their hull glowing cherry red and half their systems dead, and Sarah slumped in her seat with blood streaming from her nose and ears. But alive they were alive, and they were 400 light-years from home. And they had done it without the Concorde's permission or their gates or anything except human stubbornness and a willingness to burn. Commander, Jonah said, his voice shaking as he checked her vitals. Commander, can you hear me? Sarah forced her eyes open and looked at the view screen, at the stars that surrounded them. Stars that no human had seen in almost 40 years. Patch me through, she whispered, her voice raw and broken. Every frequency, every species, every station in range. You need medical attention. Jonah protested. I will get medical attention after I deliver a message, Sarah replied. And there was steel in her voice despite the weakness in her body. Patch me through now. Jonah hesitated for only a moment before obeying. And soon the communications array was broadcasting on every channel known to the Concorde. Sarah straightened in her seat. wiped the blood from her face, and faced the camera. "This is Commander Sarah Vance of the human vessel Defiance," she said, and her voice carried across 100 light-years to the ears of 1,000 species who had forgotten humanity even existed 37 years ago. "You sealed us behind your gates, and you thought you could contain us. And you thought we would simply accept our place in the cage you built for us." She smiled, and there was triumph in her eyes. "You were wrong, and somewhere in the vastness of space, 17 Concord monitoring stations detected the breach signature and began transmitting alerts to every corner of the galaxy. Humanity had returned, and this time, they had brought their own fire." The response from the Concord came faster than Sarah had expected within 2 hours of their emergence from the breach. A fleet of 12 warships dropped out of quantum transit and surrounded the Defiance with weapons armed and shields raised. The Archon's voice crackled over the communications array, as cold and emotionless as it had been 40 years ago when it had sentenced humanity to isolation. "Commander Sarah Vance, you have committed an act of war against a Concord of 12 species, and you will surrender your vessel immediately or face destruction." Sarah leaned back in her pilot's seat, ignoring the pain that still radiated through every nerve in her body, and smiled at the view screen. "Archon," she replied, "it has been a long time. This is not a negotiation," the crystalline being declared. "You have violated the terms of humanity's confinement, and you have demonstrated a technology that threatens the stability of galactic civilization. And you will surrender now." "I do not think I will," Sarah said calmly. She reached for the controls, and before the Concord fleet could react, the Prometheus engine roared to life again. The breach opened directly in front of the Defiance, and Sarah plunged into the chaos once more, leaving the Concord warships staring at empty space where their prey had been only moments before. This time, the pain was worse, because her body was still recovering from the first jump, and she felt something tear inside her chest as she fought to maintain control through the impossible geometries of the breach. But she held on, and 4.3 seconds later, they emerged in a completely different sector of space, surrounded by a cluster of space stations belonging to a species called the Vethkai. The Vethkai had been conquered by the Concord 3 centuries ago. Their faster-than-light technology confiscated, and their species confined to a handful of systems under strict supervision. They had been watching the communications channels when Sarah made her broadcast, and they had been waiting. "Human vessel," a Vethkai voice called over the comms, speaking in heavily accented but understandable standard. "We saw your transmission, and we wish to know if what you said was true." Sarah transmitted the complete specifications of the Prometheus engine, every equation and every schematic and every piece of data that the Ember Project had accumulated over 40 years of research. "Build your own door," she said. "The Concord cannot control what they did not give you." The Defiance jumped again before the Concord fleet could catch up, emerging this time near the quarantine zone around the Marani homeworld. The Marani had been isolated for 200 years, declared a threat to galactic stability because their culture was too aggressive and their population was growing too fast. They had never stopped fighting for their freedom, and they had never stopped dreaming of the stars. Sarah transmitted the engine specifications again and again and again, jumping from system to system and leaving the blueprints behind like seeds scattered across fertile ground. Each jump took more out of her than the last. She could feel her body failing, her heart stuttering and her vision blurring, and her hands shaking on the controls. But she refused to stop because every system she visited was another species that had been locked away by the Concord. Another world full of beings who had been told they were not worthy of the stars, and every single one of them received the gift she carried. "Commander," Jonah said urgently, monitoring her vitals from his station, "your heart rate is dropping, and your neural activity is showing signs of severe strain. And if you make another jump, you might not survive. Then we make it count." Sira replied. She plotted the coordinates for one final destination. The one place she had wanted to reach since the day the tribunal had sentenced her people to isolation, Concordia Prime, the capital world of the Concord, the seat of power for the beings who had decided that humanity deserved to be locked in a cage. "You cannot be serious," Jonah protested. "That system will be the most heavily defended location in the entire galaxy, and we will be destroyed before we even complete the breach." "Maybe," Sira agreed, "but they will see us coming, and they will know that we were never afraid." She activated the Prometheus engine one final time, and the breach tore open in front of them like a wound in the fabric of existence. The pain was beyond anything she had experienced before, a white-hot agony that burned through every cell in her body and threatened to tear her consciousness apart. She saw flashes of other realities again, glimpses of paths not taken and futures that might have been. And somewhere in the chaos, she saw a vision of herself as a young woman standing before the tribunal with her head held high. She had told the Archon to watch her, and now she was going to make sure it did. The Defiance burst out of the breach in the sky above Concordia Prime, its hull trailing fire and its engines screaming with the strain of 7 consecutive jumps below them. The capital world of the Concord spread out in all its ancient glory. Cities made of crystal and light covering continents that had been civilized for millions of years, and above them, the entire defensive fleet of the Concord mobilized to destroy the tiny human vessel that had dared to violate their most sacred space. But Sira was not there to fight. She was there to deliver a message. "Open all channels," she commanded, her voice barely a whisper now. "Maximum broadcast power, every frequency, every species." Jonah obeyed, and Sira forced herself to sit upright despite the blood that stained her uniform and the weakness that pulled at her limbs. "This is Commander Sira Vance," she said, and her words echoed across the entire Concord network, heard by trillions of beings on thousands of worlds. 40 years ago, you sealed humanity behind your gates, and you thought you had contained us." She transmitted the sensor data from their journey, showing every system they had visited and every species that had received the Prometheus engine specifications. "But I did not come back just to free my own people," she continued. "I came back to free everyone you have ever locked away, every species you have ever told that they were not ready for the stars, every world you have ever quarantined because they threatened your control." The first Vethkai ship completed its breach at that exact moment, emerging from the chaos in a system that had not seen a free Vethkai vessel in 300 years. Then another breach opened, and another, as species across the galaxy began testing the technology that Sira had given them. "Your gates were never about protecting the galaxy," Sira said, watching the Concord's carefully controlled order begin to crumble before her eyes. "They were about protecting your power, and now that power is gone." The Archon's voice cut through the transmission, filled with something that might have been fear for the first time in its ancient existence. "You have destroyed the peace that has held this galaxy together for 15,000 years. It declared, you have unleashed chaos that will take centuries to control." "No," Sira replied, and despite her weakness, there was fire in her voice. "I have given the galaxy back its freedom, and what they do with it is up to them." She slumped back in her seat, her body finally giving out after pushing past every limit it had. But she was smiling because through the view screen she could see breaches opening all across Concord space. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, as every species the Concord had ever oppressed took their first steps toward true freedom. The cage was broken, and humanity had been the one to break it. The breach over Concordia Prime was the largest ever recorded in galactic history, a tear in reality that stretched across thousands of kilometers, and burned with impossible light visible from the surface of the planet below. The Concorde's defensive fleet held their positions around the Defiance, but they did not fire, because every being in the galaxy was watching, and because the crystalline spires of the Tribunal Hall were reflecting the colors of the breach for all to see. Sarah Vance was dying. She knew it with the certainty that comes at the end of a long journey, when the body has given everything it has, and there is nothing left to give. But she was not finished yet. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the alarm still screaming through the damaged ship. "Help me sit up." The young pilot moved to her side and gently lifted her into a proper position, his hands steady despite the tears that streamed down his face. "You should rest," he said. "You should let me handle the communications and let the medical systems try to stabilize you." "There is no stabilizing what is happening to me," Sarah replied. "The breaches took everything I had, and I have maybe an hour left if I am lucky." She reached out and gripped his hand with what little strength remained in her fingers. "But I have one more thing to say, and I need you to make sure everyone hears it." Jonah nodded and opened the communication channels one final time, broadcasting Sarah's words to every corner of the galaxy, where beings were watching the impossible scene unfolding above the Concorde's capital world. "I am not here to destroy you," Sarah said, and her voice carried across the stars to the tribunal that had condemned her, and to the species that had feared humanity, and to the countless worlds that had been locked away for millennia. "I am here to remind you of something you forgot." She transmitted the final sensor readings, showing the breaches opening across Concorde space, showing the Vethkai ships emerging for the first time in centuries, and the Marani fleets leaving their quarantine zone, and dozens of other species taking their first free steps into a galaxy that had denied them for so long. "You sealed us away because we were dangerous," she continued. "You called us volatile and young and unpredictable. And you were right about all of those things." She paused to cough, and blood stained her lips. But she forced herself to keep speaking. "But you missed something important about us. Something that you could never understand because you had forgotten what it meant to struggle." The Archon's image appeared on her view screen, the crystalline being watching from the tribunal hall below as its carefully constructed empire crumbled around it. "And what is that?" "Commander Vance," it asked, and for once there was genuine curiosity in its resonating voice. Sarah smiled, and it was the smile of someone who has finally completed the work of a lifetime. "We are not special," she said. "We are not the only species in this galaxy that dreams of the stars. And we are not the only ones willing to burn for our freedom." She gestured at the sensor display, at the hundreds of breaches now opening across Concorde space. "The Vethkai remember what it was like to be free, and the Marani never stopped fighting for their future. And there are 1,000 other species out there who were told they were not worthy of the stars." Her voice grew stronger despite her fading body, filled with the conviction of someone who has seen the truth clearly. "You did not contain dangerous species. You created them because every time you locked someone away, you gave them a reason to break free. And every time you told someone they were not ready, you made them determined to prove you wrong." She looked directly at the Archon, meeting its faceted eyes across the vast distance between them. "Humanity did not save the galaxy," she said. "We just remembered that fire spreads." The Defiance shuddered as its remaining systems began to fail, and Jonah moved to stabilize the ship while Sarah watched the view screen with fading eyes across the galaxy. Species that had been locked away for centuries were emerging from their cages. The Vethkai were singing songs of freedom that had been forbidden for 300 years. The Marani were launching ships that had been hidden in secret shipyards, waiting for the day when they would finally have a way to fly them and on 100 other worlds. Beings who had been told they were not worthy of the stars were looking up at the sky and seeing possibility for the first time in their lives. "Commander," Jonah said quietly, "the Concorde fleet is withdrawing, and they are not going to fire." Sierra nodded, unsurprised. "They cannot kill us without proving that everything I said was right, that they are not protectors but jailers, and that their empire was built on fear rather than consent." She reached out and touched the view screen, her fingers brushing against the image of the breach still burning above Concordia Prime. "Besides," she added, "it is too late to stop what we started. And even the Archon knows it." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of fading consciousness and quiet conversations. Jonah held her hand as the medical systems did what little they could to ease her pain. And together, they watched the sensor feeds showing the new galaxy. Being born around them, breaches opened in. Systems that had been isolated for millennia. Species that had never been allowed to meet each other made first contact without the Concorde's permission trade routes that had been controlled for 15,000 years suddenly became free for anyone to travel, and through it all, humanity's signal broadcast outward from the Defiance. A reminder that the cage had been broken and that no one would ever be locked away again. "Commander," Jonah said softly, as Sierra's eyes began to close for the final time. "What do I tell them? The people who will come after? The ones who will want to know why you did this?" Sierra was quiet for a long moment, gathering the last of her strength for one final answer. "Tell them that I was angry," she said. "Tell them that I was hurt and stubborn and unwilling to accept what everyone told me was impossible." She opened her eyes and looked at him. At this young man who had been born in a cage, but who would live to see the stars. "But mostly tell them that I was human, and that being human means refusing to accept limits that others put on you, and fighting for the right to reach as high as you can dream." Her hand went limp in his grip, and her eyes closed. And Commander Sarah Vance passed from the world she had changed forever. But the fire she had carried did not die with her on Europa. The scientists of the Ember Project received word of their founder's death and immediately began training a new generation of breach pilots on Earth. Children who had grown up knowing nothing but the boundaries of their solar system looked up at the sky and saw breaches opening like stars being born, and across the galaxy, species that had been locked away for centuries began building futures that had been denied to them. Inspired by the human who had refused to accept that anything was impossible, the Concorde's empire did not fall in a day or a year or even a decade, but it fell nonetheless, crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions as beings everywhere realized that they did not need permission to reach for the stars, and in the end, the monument they built on Europa stood 200 meters tall, a stylized breach frozen in metal and light with a single ship emerging from its heart. Every year on the anniversary of the first breach, pilots from 100 worlds gathered there to pay their respects. They called it the Day of Fire, and they remembered the human woman who had taught the galaxy that cages are only as strong as they will to break them. Sarah Vance had burned brighter than any star the Concorde had ever catalogued, and her light would never go out because it lived on in everyone who looked up at the sky and refused to accept that they could not reach it. Humanity had not saved the galaxy. They had just reminded it what fire was for, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.